we can have something for this workshop. And it also, well, as you can see here in this slider, you can see just a few things about the platform. So the name comes from, basically it means integrated assessment models for reinforcing the Paris Agreement as part of the Paris Reinforce project. So the idea is that it can help bridge the gap between scientists and stakeholders, policymakers included. So the slider also includes some intro about the modeling documentation and, of course, the analysis. This is the one component, the modeling analysis, the one component that's obviously not ready as the project is young and we haven't started carrying out this modeling analysis. So I'm just going to be showcasing the documentation bit. As I said, it's not even a prototype, so it needs some beautification, fine-tuning, etc. So this is not, please don't judge that. It's, let's say, a zero-order draft of the prototype. So I'm going to start backwards, the other way around. I will start with detailed documentation of the models. So first of all, in this section, we can select whichever model we want. We have divided them into global models, national and regional models for Europe, and national and regional models for countries outside Europe. The idea is that, of course, the global models have the capacity for the regional granularity to cover countries and regions in specific parts of the world, but they are global. So this is why they are documented separately. Then we have those models that have the capacity to explicitly cover Europe, or this is how we choose to use them in the project, and then the models outside for countries outside Europe. So that would include, for example, Markal, India, and I don't know, like the Russian Conto or the Brazilian Cisgema model, etc. So just to showcase this a bit, so by clicking in a model, we can also use the content navigator. So we can see a lot of information, a detailed documentation for this model. It has, it actually explicitly and in detail, thoroughly covers the key features, the coverage, the capacity in terms of the energy system coverage, the economic activities, time divisions, databases, what emissions it can cover, what socioeconomic dimensions and how it needs or gives output for, how it's calibrated, the economic rationale, etc. So, although it might look a bit technical, for example, for this model, it's actually have put a lot of effort into making things easier to digest, so the language is very carefully selected for non-experts to understand. So it also has some examples. So this is the case for all the models. You can easily navigate through this menu and see for whichever model you want to see some things in detail. So this would be the part about the detailed documentation of the models. Moving on now to the overview and the comparative assessment. Again, the same categorization. By choosing each of these categories, we can see some comparative assessments, some comparisons between the models of this category. So we figured this is an important section of this exercise, so that we can cover in detail what specific models can and cannot do. So as has been covered, the project actually includes in its armory more than 20 models. So these models have different capacities, have different mathematical and theoretical foundations. So it's only natural they work in different ways. They cover different sectors. They can represent different kinds of policies now or provisionally. They also have different implications for different SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals of the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Some information about how they can calculate the mitigation pathways, again some use cases, and finally a section that basically redirects to the, as you can see, to the policy brief that has been printed and handed out to you. Hopefully everyone has one of those. So this is pretty much about the comparative assessment component of the platform. So this is the same thing about all the models. We have tried to incorporate the same kind of, and the same level of detail and the same structure for all the models. So a lot of, again, too much effort has been put into harmonizing everything, as you can imagine, and those who are more familiar with models know very well that some models have different features and capacities than others. So I will now be going to the dynamic documentation. So as you can also see on your devices, there's a menu here. We will be changing that. So we will try to finalize a layout. And as I will explain later on, we will have the chance to ask you to tell us how to better create that layout. So we have some options here. I'm not going to assign names or say more stuff about that, because I do not want to mislead you for your preferences. So I'm just going to use the first version for now. So as you can see, here, for example, we have preloaded the first model, Giga model. So as Vangelis said, there are three sections here. One section is about the input. So the input is whatever the user selects based on their preferences regarding what model they want to see information about. So this information is about Giga, but as you can see, we can easily check about other models. So the page dynamically loads information about that. And what kind of information, I will just explain to you right now. So I'll just go back to GCAM, just indicatively, because we have representatives in the panel for that model. So as you can see here, in the second, let's say, component of the dynamic documentation, which is in the form of an infographic, a dynamic infographic, as you can see. So there's a lot of information here. First of all, it shows exactly which countries and which regions this model can cover. So you can spot the many different colors here. The idea is that each first of all, we use a specific grade of a specific shade of green to represent which countries are covered nationally, so by this model. So this means, for example, that the United States of America and Canada are covered as nations, as countries in this model, which means that we also have different levels of detail for countries that are nationally covered than by countries that are not nationally covered, which means that they are regionally covered. So expectedly, all the global models, which are in the first row here, cover the entire world. This is the expected case, obviously. But the information here is that, for example, you can also zoom in, you can navigate through the map. You can see, for example, that this model, the GICA model as a global model, does not have a national level granularity for Spain, or in any case for the European member states. So this information here says that Spain is covered, but it's part of a region that's called EU15. And this is the same case, for example, for Portugal or for Germany, etc. Or we have a different region for the Czech Republic. It's part of the EU12 group, the EU12 region. So this color is for the national coverage. All the other colors are for different regions. So the idea is that a region is represented by a unique color. So North African with this shade of light green. Then we have a light blue for the Western African region, etc., etc. So as you move, you navigate through the models, you can see that this map actually loads different kind of information. We have tried to incorporate all the relevant information here. So this is the second component, and I'm moving on to the final component of the platform. So that would be the sectoral, the policy, the emissions, the measures and technologies, the SDG implications, and the socioeconomic granularity or coverage of this model. So again, in the GICA model, which is a bit unfair because it has everything activated. So you can see here in the sectoral coverage, for example, that it covers all the relevant sectors, industry, energy sources, the FOLU sector, energy transformation, and at the same time, by hovering hovering over these icons, you can see, for example, what exactly it can cover in this sector. So, for example, it says here in the industry sector, it doesn't cover a specific industry, but it has an aggregated representation of the industry sector. So, for example, for buildings, you can see with green color what is activated, so what is represented in the model, whereas with gray and strike through, you can see which features are not covered by this model, but obviously they are covered by other models, and this is why they are included in this pop-up. So, as you can see, for example, the energy sources and the energy transformation sub-sectors, if I may say, are covered in a way better detail than industry, which is covered as an aggregate, let's say, indicator or set of indices, etc. So moving on to the emissions, we can see that the Giga model actually covers all different kinds of greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants. So we have tried to also explain to the user in the pop-up, if they're not familiar, what maybe they know the emissions by the name, but in any case, we also describe whether they are endogenously or exogenously covered. So this means also that, for example, methane and CO2, for example, are covered endogenously, which means that they are calculated, their emission levels are calculated by the model, whereas exogenous means that this is part of an input, and it is used as an input parameter for calculating other stuff in the model. So this is the basic difference between the two. Moving on to the mitigation adaptation measures, it's the same thing as with the sectoral coverage. So we have added more detail into what kind of technologies and measures for mitigation mostly, but also for adaptation, as you can see here, are actually covered by the model. We have tried to group them as best as possible. So, for example, for aviation, you can see what kind of technologies are covered, for modal shifts, for behavioral changes, etc. So, again, the green color indicates what is covered in the model within the pop-up window, wherever the gray strike through indicates that this particular thing is not covered. So, this is the same thing with different policy instruments. We have grouped them into emissions mitigation policy instruments, energy policy instruments, land policy instruments, and trade policy instruments. So, for example, you can see here that the Giga model cannot adequately represent some trade policy instruments. But this is not the case, for example, for all the other categories. And exactly what kind of policy instruments we have tried to use as much information as possible inside these windows that pop up. So it's the same with the socioeconomics. Of course, we haven't managed here to also depict what kind of metrics are used here endogenously or exogenously represented in the model. It's something, for example, that the user may be able to go into the detailed documentation and see in detail, because, as I said, this is supposed to be a very helpful dynamic infographic. As you can see, it's a single page layout. So, you can only fit as much information. And finally, we have the SDG granularity. Again, you can see the SDGs here. We opted for different icons than the indicated ones by the UN, so that we are, more flexible to change colors and stuff, which we are not so much allowed to do so. So you can see here all SDGs. Evidently, all models can cover climate action because that's their main area, but we can see what kind of implications they can have for the SDGs. So what kind of metrics they can calculate for different SDGs. For example, the Giga model cannot calculate something for the eliminating poverty in all forms everywhere, sustainable development goal, but it has something for zero hunger. And we can see beneath that, underneath that, what specific measure it has, what metric it has for this SDG, for example. So this changes here for every model. And this concludes the dynamic documentation, but before joining back the panel, there's also a different, so I didn't show that, but when you hover over the models, you can see some very brief summary of these models. Hopefully as comprehensive as possible. And by clicking on the information icon, I can directly go to the detailed documentation of this model, so I can see all the information there. So this concludes this presentation of the platform. Just a very quick note. I'll just go to the homepage. So we'll be showing later on the different versions of this layout, so only 4 basically alternatives upon which you can select. So in this version, for example, we have more information about the models, but then again we keep things as simple as possible. Then we have a different layout, a different alternative that we have considered and designed. It adds something to the map. So instead of having just a map, it also has a legend here saying more information about what this map actually shows, because not every user will have the opportunity to listen to my voice, guiding them through the platform. So one final alternative, which as you can see is a more detailed one. It includes as much information as possible, so it has a larger map, it has the legend, it has again the names of the models, and below that you can see also you can see in detail with some titles for the icons, etc., etc. So this is basically the platform. So now I'll be joining you to resume the session and kick off the discussion with the audience.